Thank you all for making time in your schedule to join us today. And to everyone tuning in now, welcome to Accountable Tech's Youth Roundtable on social media's harms to young people with United States Senator Richard Blumenthal. My name is Jillian Karen. I'm a graduate of American University and currently the Digital Associate here at Accountable Tech. We're joined by Zaman Qureshi, Policy Advisor and Social Media Coordinator for the Real Facebook Oversight Board, Emma Lemke, founder of the Log Off Movement and co-founder of Technically Politics, Chloe Schrager, the co-founder and COO of Assemble, Sophia Angela, a developer, activist, and digital strategist, and United States Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. Whistleblower documents brought forth last fall revealed Facebook was sitting on data that showed its platform inflicts harm on the youngest and most vulnerable users. Rather than confronting the facts and sharing with users, parents, and elected officials, Facebook hid its research from the public. Among many other unsettling statistics, Facebook's own internal research showed that, quote, 32% of teen girls said that when they felt bad about their bodies, Instagram made them feel worse, end quote. Senator Blumenthal has been at the forefront of fighting to hold social media companies accountable in the US Senate. He's spearheaded a series of hearings on big tech's harms to young people and introduced the Kids Online Safety Act to empower kids and teens online and to hold big tech accountable. It's been a real honor and privilege to have the chance to speak with Senator Blumenthal, who has generously provided his time to talk with us about our experiences with social media. Senator Blumenthal, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to see if you have a few words you'd like to share with us as we start today's roundtable conversation.
A very, very few words, because the real experts on this call are you, and I'm here to listen. But let me just say how grateful I am, first and foremost, for your activism. You've been really at the forefront in the trenches through the organizations you founded and other activities that have deeply engaged you in trying to make online activities safer for kids. You've been there, you know the heartbreaking stories. I've heard them in the hearings that we held on our subcommittee. And I've also seen outrageously the kind of defiance from many of the big tech platforms. Social media has often aggravated the mental health crisis that we face in this country, and it has betrayed the trust of countless Americans. Now we have the obligation and opportunity to use measures like the Kids Online Safety Act to make it safer and open the black box algorithms, make them transparent, give parents tools and young people those tools, because very often they feel powerless in the face of content about bullying, the social eating disorders, even suicide and substance abuse. So giving them more control or giving them back control over their lives is very, very important. And so I just close by saying this is a bipartisan effort. I think it has momentum, very strong support on both sides of the aisle. If you came to our hearings and you closed your eyes, you couldn't tell whether it was a Republican or a Democrat expressing outrage, asking questions, because this cause cuts across partisan lines. And I really am very, very grateful to every one of you for your advocacy, your activism. And so we can work together, and really here to listen, not to talk. So back to you.
Thank you so much. It means a lot to have you on our side. So to each of the other participants who have joined our discussion, can you just start by introducing yourself? And if you don't mind sharing your own personal experiences of how social media has affected your life or your friends and family's lives.
I'll go ahead and start if no one else is going to start. Sorry about that, Chloe. So my name is Sophia Ongala. My pronouns are she, her. I very transparently got my first social media account at the age of 9 when it wasn't technically allowed for me to, but at that age I had learned arithmetic and I knew how many years I had to add for myself to be allowed on that platform. My parents found out, they took the account down, but then at the age of 11, I got all the other social media platforms because I had just started middle school and that was sort of like the normal age for people to start social media. I was on Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, like basically everything that was normal for teens to have at that point. And personally, like I had gained so much exposure to eating disorder content on the platform. I was so surprised by how good statistics, I mean, the findings that Instagram had being lower than 50. I personally think it's probably higher than that because almost everyone I know has seen that kind of content, become vulnerable to that content. I still have screenshots from my Google Photos from like 2015, where it's like saying the different calories of different foods or like how to get a thigh gap or things like that. And even though that was so long ago, the negative effects of social media continue to follow you as you grow older, because I think I speak for a lot of the panelists when I say this, but like the majority of our lives we spent on social media. So it's kind of wired into the way that we communicate and we operate now. I personally have family back in East Africa. I don't know if you recently saw the data about how Facebook is like very, very like criminally underpaying content moderators in Kenya and other areas where they're being exposed to really, really, really grotesque things because their content moderators are not able to capture every single bad thing that happens on the platform. And I think we've also seen that it doesn't only affect kids, it also affects like adults. If we saw what happened on January 6th, like these technologies are being harnessed by bad actors. And it's incredibly important that we really rein in big tech.
Great. Thank you.
I can share next. I think something Sophia touched on kind of feeds into a lot of my experience. Hello, I'm Chloe. I'm a student at Stanford University, and I took a year off last year to focus on founding a nonprofit called Assemble, which I was working on with a group of my peers. Essentially, Assemble is an ethical tech or an ethical social media platform specifically for social activism and online organizing. So our whole mission was really birthed in the aftermath of George Floyd's passing, when activists of all levels and activism experience and all walks of life really flocked to Instagram and Facebook to continue their usually in-person activism online and remotely during the COVID lockdown. During that time, we did see so much good come out of this outpour of advocacy online, but I think it also highlighted the deep-rooted evils of many of these big tech platforms. We saw misinformation running completely wild and unchecked. Instagram's algorithm was promoting more of a siloed and polarizing news feed than a useful one. Police were tracking peaceful activist protests with the intent of making arrests, and the advertising business model that monetizes young people's attention really just kind of accelerated all of these issues. Ultimately, it came down to one core issue, which was that activists were trying to organize on platforms that were pretty much the antithesis of their moral missions. And I remember there was one event in particular that kind of struck deep. In the early weeks of the BLM protests, our team happened upon a protest being organized on Facebook against Facebook's privately funded Palo Alto police force. We just thought that was too bad to be true and that there had to be a better way to be organizing. So we saw an opportunity and started working on a platform that was ethical, nonprofit, not driven by moral corrupting profits, specifically for activists to organize on safely, share activism news without the fear of police tracking or infiltration, and without the fear of their information being misconstrued or lost in the void. So our focuses were definitely, yes, on kids' safety, but also on adults, activists, and just in general, vulnerable communities. And I think those are a lot of the people that big tech and the moral driven or the profit, sorry, not moral driven, profit driven morals of big tech really are the most dangerous for.
That was great. Thank you.
I can go next. Sophia, Chloe, thank you so much for sharing. Those are super important and incredible stories. I just want to echo that as well. I think the harms that have been felt from the people in my community growing up and in high school, in middle school, it was constantly about being on social media, seeing what new content was being put out, and the Frances Haugen papers, the Facebook files, highlighted eating disorders in teen girls and young women. I think those same issues can be transferred to young men and boys growing up and seeing influencer after influencer and your own peers having to meet this sort of higher social standard, and then constantly being bombarded with either ads or even posts that force people to have to question themselves and who they are. I think Instagram's own research highlights that a lot more needs to be done in this area. And then, Senator, when you were asking Adam Mosseri of Instagram, telling him that your office had created an account, and that account within the first few days or the first few hours was already showing content that promoted eating disorders. As you were saying that, I went on my phone, I created an Instagram account as a 15-year-old girl, and I got the same exact content. It was instantaneous. I followed it throughout the day, and my Explore page was covered with this kind of eating disorder content. So I think that all of us here today, we recognize just how big a problem this is, and we're here to humanize the data, humanize the stories that have been told, and try and frame the policy in a way that can really get at protecting us, because we are the primary users of these platforms. All of us here recognize that social media isn't going away. And while there are benefits that we've all experienced, the tremendous harms outweigh those benefits when you're talking about suicide ideations and self-harm. These are things that have to be addressed. And Senator, as you have said and you have championed, for too long, we have trusted these big tech companies to do it themselves. And that self-regulation period is now over.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hello, Senator. Thank you again for being here today and listening to all of our stories. My own experience with digital well-being was really catalyzed by an incredibly negative and parasitic relationship with social media that is similar to Sophia. Started when I was younger and a little more naive and really unaware of the harmful environments that I was entering into, specifically as a young female. So I got my social media accounts, largely Instagram and then eventually Snapchat, starting in middle school in 6th grade. I was one of the last in my friends group to kind of get those accounts. And I specifically just remember thinking, there has to be something amazing on these accounts, and on Instagram, I have to be able to connect with so many different people, because my friends are opting to put their eyes down on the screens instead of up at me when we're all together and gathered. So after that, I finally bombarded my parents and got them to give me the reins to have my own social media accounts. And very quickly, I began to develop an incredibly parasitic relationship with social media that led to a social media addiction. I was spending about 5 to 6 hours on these platforms daily. And I really began to get sucked into these false narratives that were perpetuated on social media. Specifically, I began to quantify my own worth with likes, comments, and followers, and also just qualify my life based on this highlight reel. I began looking at my friends and celebrities and asking, why do I not look like this? How can I create this ideal Emma Lemke on social media that can then represent myself in a larger fashion? And that subsequently led to increased rates of anxiety and depression. And I'm someone who I have an anxiety disorder and I have OCD. And I was never warned that entering these online platforms would only amplify the things that I already struggled with. I was never told that I was entering a space where addictive algorithms were at play and that companies were prioritizing profit over their own products' impact on my mental health. And that really did lead to issues long term. And again, like I said, increased rates of anxiety that were incredibly hard to deal with. And then as a young female, being in this very important developmental period in my life, I entered these apps, and exactly with what you all have said, I was fed harmful content that specifically made me subscribe to unrealistic body standards, and that really perpetuated a deterioration of my own self-image. And giving that to young females, specifically again at this developmental period, is incredibly harmful to the long-term trajectory of my life and how I view myself. It really, when I saw the statistics too, like Sophia said, I was like 32%. 32%, every single woman that I've talked to in young female has said that they have felt this way at some point or gotten harmful content or struggled with eating because of social media. Those stories are really prominent. So I really consider myself part of that 32%. But even after all of these negative effects on my mental health, I remained on these apps. And that was largely due to the fact that I felt this need to be on these platforms. I felt this addiction and this pull as though I had lost agency. And as a young female and as a young person, that's incredibly scary to say that I don't have control over my ability to enter these platforms and exit. And that really placed me in a position where I wanted to explore why I was losing my agency, why I didn't have control, and how, again, we can have this conversation about better tech habits because the genie's out of the bottle. We know that we're not going to go back to a place where social media isn't really integral to growing up. So how can we really amplify those benefits while mitigating those harms? And that's when I founded the Log Off movement, which is just a movement dedicated to rethinking social media by teens for teens, kind of creating those conversations. And now that has evolved into an advocacy leg, technically politics, which works specifically to highlight and interview teens and gather those testimonials to push forth regulation, to really put a face to this problem. So I'm incredibly thankful to be here with you today and to tell my story.
Thank you all so much for opening yourselves up and making yourselves vulnerable. We all really, really appreciate it. For me personally, I remember being like 14 and begging my parents for an iPhone so I could make an Instagram, but I suppose in hindsight, they were making the right decision. I've definitely grown up alongside the evolution of social media, so I've seen it be used for good, but also unravel into something that feels uncontrollable. I think there's something really fulfilling about the opportunity to create a community outside of my physical one. But it definitely sometimes feels like social media has become something that's too big to control on a personal level. So just a follow-up question for our participants. How are you taking your frustrations, anger, or challenges from social media and turning them into action?
I'll start again. Hi. So basically, there's a couple legs to this personally. Like I am a computer science major. I'm a computer scientist at my core. So when I first learned to code, it was sort of like the norm was to end up being this like hotshot engineer who like worked at Facebook or Google or one of the big ones. And something that's become really important to me is public interest technology and really making sure that whoever is building our technology is grounded in ethics. So I've taught computer science for 4 summers with an organization called Code with Clossy. They teach girls ages 13 to 18 how to code. And we have sessions within there where we teach about like the importance of being ethical, the importance to understand biases when you're programming something, which is something that I think a lot of these companies oftentimes overlook. Also, as a content creator, like I personally am on TikTok and I create content. I have like almost 300,000 followers there. And while I create content there, I try to remain as real as possible, because I think part of the reason that so much of Gen Z has gravitated towards TikTok is a lot less polished, right? Like I feel like on Instagram, we're like, we have to look a certain way and dress a certain way and all these things. And I've personally like sobbed on my TikTok account and like people are like, oh, that's relatable because people have emotions. And I also try to make things like the Facebook files, for example, more consumable for people who don't have a technical background, because I feel like a lot of the time with these tech platforms, they're doing all of these things in the background, exactly as the senator was saying, these black box algorithms where people don't really understand what's going on. I really try to work to demystify that for as many people as possible.
That's awesome, Sophia. I can talk a little bit next. So I mentioned Assemble. I founded that with a group of my peers last year, over which the period of our gap year, we brought together over about 20 local nonprofits and community organizations and a beta group of about 50 self-identifying youth activists onto our initial platform. And over last year and continuing now, we have conducted in-depth needs finding with activists of all levels, self-proclaimed like 16-year-olds who are absorbing news on Facebook and Instagram, and lifetime activists alike, to really get to the center of what is the root of their problem and really make sure our platform develops in a way that is addressing their core issues. We have also worked with a lot of experts in the ethical tech field, including the lovely folks over at the Social Dilemma Netflix documentary, and just learned a lot from those individuals that we've been able to kind of hone into what we want our mission platform to be. Off of what Emma said earlier about never having been warned about the realities of these platforms before entering them, I think something that has really struck deep with me throughout my time in this field is the idea that if you cannot identify the product, you are the product. And user attention is monetized in a way that has no regard for our well-being on these platforms, because we are in fact how they are making money. And I think that really gets to the root of the evil about big tech platforms. And so that's really been a driving mission for Assemble, and something we are hoping to continue to grow towards. We still have a long road ahead of us, especially as the founding team finishes up college, but we're incredibly proud of the energy we've amassed so far and excited to continue down this path.
Yeah, thanks, Chloe and Sophia, for sharing. The work that I've been really privileged to do for the Real Facebook Oversight Board, basically an organization set up by journalists, activists, researchers to hold Facebook accountable when the company set up its own oversight board, which was not independent or transparent in any way. I'm not sure if I've cut out. Am I back?
You're there.
Okay. And so some of the work that I've been able to do is meet with members of Congress and their staff and talk about some of these issues, talk about what needs to be focused on when these Facebook executives come before Congress, and talk about the issues that are core to Facebook and the reasons why we need to be asking like very pointed questions. It is, for far too long, I think we've seen executives come before Congress and mislead or sometimes even lie to the committees. And so my work around Facebook has really been to push for those important questions, and also to humanize the legislation as well. Talk about the reasons why data matters and why data is core to this conversation, as Chloe very eloquently touched on. The data is core to the business model, and we as young people don't really, I think our generation doesn't really have a grasp necessarily of how core it is. And so I try to, talk to my peers and educate where I can about how important, the information that you're putting onto these platforms is. I remember having a conversation with one of my friends. He told me to download a new app, and thanks to Apple's new privacy features, you can now see which data is being collected on you by apps in the App Store. And so I looked at this app and I kind of showed him, I was like, hey, look at all this data that's being collected if I download this app. And his response was kind of like, well, so what? All the rest of my apps are collecting data. So why not just download this one? And that, I think, is representative of the feeling that a lot of Gen Z and young people have to this issue. I think the vast majority of us recognize that there's a problem, but too many of us don't know how to address that problem. And so, Senator, your bill will give tools to parents and kids, which is really important. But we also need education on why it's important to use those tools and how we can protect ourselves with those tools. Because I think simply giving tools is like, it's too overwhelming for young people to have to parse through their Instagram settings or their, TikTok preferences. And so I'm hoping that by all of us being here today and continuing to push our activism, hopefully together going forward, we can kind of be the conduits for education of our generation, and push forward legislation and policies that put data at the front of it.
Thank you.
And I completely agree with all of the panelists, and I'm so honored to be with them here, because I think their work is unbelievably impactful and kind of sparking change. And I think that for me, when I had my own negative experience with social media, what I realized is for me to begin to take action to change kind of the ecosystem that we're in right now and to help protect users and teens within these online spaces, people had to start talking. And I think that was the biggest issue, is I said teens are not talking to one another and we're not really discussing this. Therefore, how should we be able, and how should we have the expectation for lawmakers and policymakers to know exactly what we need in regards to protecting us online? So my response to that was the log off movement. Log off and technically politics largely were just two efforts of mine to say, let's get teens together. Let's create an epicenter where youth voices can come together. We can share stories. We can talk about how tech has really impacted us. And being that generation that has been in these unregulated online spaces, we can then discuss, okay, how can we move forward? What needs to end? What needs to be amplified so that another generation isn't impacted like this? And I think that with log off and technically politics specifically, I've been interviewing alongside my co-founder, Eliza Copens, we've been interviewing people on WashU and Brown's campuses asking, what has your experience with technology been? What do you want to see change in the regulatory space? And a lot of people are saying, we just want to be listened to, because a lot of times in these conversations, youth voices are not at the center. And we really are, like you said earlier, we're the experts on this. We're the generation that has grown up having social media be a part of the DNA of who we really are. And I think that specifically with storytelling and talking, it puts faces to these problems. And a lot of times, it can be an incredibly abstract statistical world where you see a statistic like 32% of girls say that they're like negatively impacted. But when you hear a story, there's so much more weight to that. So really what I've been doing with log off and technically politics and my own advocacy work is working to uplift those voices so that policymakers can then see how we're being negatively impacted and can then work to produce the most effective and productive legislation that will result in the protection of users in these very dangerous online spaces.
Thank you all so much for the amazing work you're doing. So my next question is, how can policymakers be more helpful in addressing your concerns?
I can kick it off just kind of piggybacking off of what Emma just said. I think the core of the issue is just involving young people. I think events like these are vital. And so, Senator, I commend and thank you for dedicating your time to speak with us. But I do think it goes beyond just the needs finding process. I think involving young professional stakeholders and youth who are affected by this every single day of their life in every step along the way of the policymaking process is absolutely essential. I think there can be infrastructure for youth to author and propose bills, to support the lobbying process, increase the involvement of pre-professional young people in government. I think there is a lot more that can be done to bring the highest stakeholders in this situation in at every single step of the process of legislation.
I completely agree with Chloe. I feel like it's really as simple as that, like involving us in every single step of the process. Like, I think that one of the scariest things for me personally, and I feel like the panelists will probably agree, is like being very young and seeing like public trust in democracy erode at a very, very, very large scale level. It's a horrifying, horrifying thing to see at the beginning of our lives. And I think that's something that would really, really help with that, considering we've been on these platforms the majority of our lives since we were I'm not going to say babies, but like very, very, very young children. I think it's incredibly important to have our voices at the table. And I think the Kids Online Safety Council is a great start. And I think it's important to have some kind of youth advisory board with this legislation, with even like the hearings and stuff, because I feel like we have such a tactile understanding of the way that these platforms are being waged against us.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to echo what Chloe, Sophia, Emma have said, young people need to be at the forefront of this conversation. I would even go so far as to say, if there is the means and the will and the interest to do so, is to hold a hearing with young people, put us, next to some of these policies, and let us sort of share our stories to the country, to Congress, and to the country. I think it's really critical that not only do we as a generation push for these kinds of changes, but that parents can also recognize that this is a really important thing that they need to get behind as well. And I think, Senator, you've shown that parents are interested and do want to be stakeholders in this, and young people should definitely be along the way for that. I also think the conversation needs to change between parents and kids. I think for far too long, parents have been putting the blame on their children when they're using these platforms. Like, why are you always on your phone? Why are you always on social media? Once we as a society can understand that that's by design, that these platforms are addictive by design, parents and young people can have a much more productive conversation where it's about, okay, we understand that these platforms are addictive. There's a common understanding. Let's work together to try and figure out how we can reduce the time spent on these platforms. And I think that's something that needs to be at the forefront of this conversation, because from my perspective and from what I see, it's too often, a parents against kids kind of thing, where it needs to be more of a collaborative movement.
And I completely agree with everything that's been said. And I'll just kind of wrap it up by saying the framing issue is the largest right now. Even when teens are involved and you hear voices, we are portrayed as passive victims rather than active participants in the conversation. And really highlighting that and saying we might not have the seats in Senate, we might not be able to make those decisions, but we still can influence the decisions being made for us. That's a really important kind of understanding to then be able to create that productive collaborative space to make productive and effective legislation. And I am absolutely thankful for senators like yourself that are working to include youth voices and to get that table reserved at the legislative space for us.
Yes, I completely agree. I think aside from just giving us a seat at the table is, I feel like, a huge barrier to entry in this issue advocacy area is that no one really knows how any of this works. So Senator, I really appreciate the emphasis on opening the black box and just kind of putting the algorithm and all of these issues in layman's terms, because only once we understand can we actually become active participants. So thank you everyone so much for sharing your stories and concerns about social media. Senator Blumenthal, can you share a little more about what you're doing today in Congress to fix these issues? And we also welcome any other questions in this conversation today.
Each of you has been so eloquent. I am just in awe. And I say that really from the heart, in awe of your ability to articulate what I have been struggling to say and convey about your experiences. And not only should you have a seat at the table, but you ought to be directing what we're doing at the table, because you are the experts. I mean, each of you has a personal experience. Emma, I was just so moved by your story. You're sharing the addiction. Let's be very blunt. And the self-awareness and information that you have developed is just so powerful. And every one of you has similar kinds of insights that I think we ought to put before my colleagues in some way, whether it's another hearing or I know we're recording this session. But the point is, as Zaman said, you have humanized a very abstract concept. You have made it real in your face and voice. And what you have said, for example, Sophia, about the erosion of trust, it is horrifying. It affects all of us. And it is particularly horrifying when it involves tech platforms, social media, that everybody thinks is on the up and up, just operating neutrally, when in fact, what they're doing is trying to get you to spend more time because they make money when your eyeballs are on the site. And what was so horrifying, to use your word, is that Facebook knew. It knew what the effects were of these algorithms and the destructive content, and it did nothing to change because it was making more money. And it's not only Facebook, it is a lot of the other big tech platforms that share the business model. The business model is more eyes, more money, drive the destructive content. So you're opening this black box for a lot of people, and I've been making notes as you've gone along. I'm sure I haven't done it justice, but I think one of the important points here is the idea of collaboration. I think, Zaman, you made this point. It's not young people against. It's not parents against. It's parents and their children and young people collaborating. I think that's a key word that you used. And the idea that they're monetizing this exploitation, Chloe, you put it very well, is so very important, because after all, at the end of the day, Facebook, now Meta, is on the New York Stock Exchange. People invest in it. They want to see what the earnings are. The earnings depend on this business model. And I think taking back control, collaborating, is so important. And you've expressed it so well. I guess my question is, to all of you, would you be willing to take a more active role? I hope the answer is yes, more active role, sort of not only through the organizations that you have founded or that you're supporting, but individually, and to enlist others, to enlist other young people in this movement to try to make online platforms safer, to make big tech more responsible, to make it accountable, because more transparency and disclosure, more tools for parents and young people, and more accountability, in my view, are so very important. So can we open this movement to more people?
I think simply yes. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, all other panelists, but I think that's really the root of all of our missions and the movements we founded and everything. I think we try to address a lot of things, but at the core of it, it is just involving more stakeholders.
I agree completely. I think more than anything, young people want their agency back. I would agree that all the parents do as well. There needs to be agency back, and we can't just, it's the same thing that Chloe was saying about The Social Dilemma, how in that film, which it's a remarkable documentary, if you haven't seen it, everyone, I suggest you see it, how they had said the only industries that call their consumers users are in the drug industry and in social media. And if we can address this addictive behavior on a collective basis, then we can make immense change. So absolutely, yes.
Great.
Absolutely. And I, again, agree with everyone. And with my role in Technically Politics, we've been compiling and interviewing teens around our campuses. So I have been posted up in cafeterias with signs and candy asking people, tell me what you think about tech, like talk with me. And my co-founder has done the same. And what we figured out is people have opinions and they care and they have experiences. It's just are people wanting to hear those, and what platforms are being given for those teens to then get involved in those conversations. And Chloe's exactly right. I think a lot of what we are all doing is trying to mobilize and get teens willing to talk and then ready to push forth change. I think that if I could go back in time, I wish I could have seen any one of these panelists at the forefront pushing forth change, saying, let me hear your story, because then I think that my story would have been completely different and I could have really avoided a lot of the harms that I was inflicted by in relation to social media. So I'm incredibly excited to see where all of these movements go, and then to continue with my own work with Technically Politics and hearing more youth stories and uplifting those so that lawmakers can see how legislation should really be tailored.
Yeah, I completely agree with all the panelists here. And I would go so far to say that this is the sort of great problem, the great epidemic of our generation. And you don't, as young people, as Gen Z, we don't really have the option or opportunity to take a step back or take a step aside, because our lives are digitized, and the pandemic only pushed us further into that more digital world. So we, as young people and collectively our generation, has to start waking up to these problems and wanting and driving action forward. So Senator, we heed your calls. We will push as much as we can, and we look forward to discussions with you and your colleagues in whatever format. But yes, the time really is now.
Well, thank you, because we're going to need you. I think this is maybe the epidemic of our time. Obviously, there are a lot of other physical ailments, COVID, opioids, some of them involve mental health, but what we've seen as a result of the pandemic is increasing problems or challenges involving mental health, and social media has just aggravated them. And that is absolutely reprehensible. So all that you say, I think Chloe made this point very well. You're the product, or we're the product. At a lot of different levels, we're the product. That's why this is a free service, or whatever you want to call it. Why you don't pay to access it, because you're the product, and we all are the product, and we have a right to stand up and make sure that our data, which belongs to us, isn't used or sold or shared without our consent. There's a whole range of areas where we need to be more protective of privacy and of the health of all of us, whatever our ages. But to come back to what I said at the very outset, you are the experts, not only in your understanding of the mechanics and the media and so forth, but also in having grown up with social media and knowing it and experienced it in a way that I think is very unique. So thank you for sharing these perspectives.
Thank you, everyone, for that. So thank you so much to all of our participants for taking the time today, and a special thank you to Senator Blumenthal for making time in his busy schedule to talk to us. We're now going to transition, thanks to everyone for tuning into the conversation, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.